police officer crosses every line when he brutally assaults a little black girl right in front of her mother, but no one expected Dwayne Johnson to step in and fight back. What happens next becomes a defining moment that changes everything. Stay tuned, subscribe, share this video, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. The sun hung high, casting golden light over the busy neighborhood park. Laughter filled the air as children raced around the playground, their joyful screams blending with the rhythmic creak of swings and the rustling of leaves. 7-year-old Ava was right in the heart of it, her braids bouncing as she giggled and climbed the monkey bars, her small hands gripping tight. "Mama, look," she called, waving down to her mother. Seated on a bench nearby, Laura watched her daughter with a soft smile. The book in her lap lay forgotten. Moments like these were rare, and she cherished them deeply. The gentle hum of parents chatting mixed with the playful shouts of kids lost in their world of fun. It was a peaceful, ordinary afternoon. Until it wasn't. A shadow loomed at the park's edge, a police officer in a crisp uniform, his gaze scanning the playground. At first, Laura didn't think much of it. Officers sometimes patrolled the area. But something about his rigid stance, the way his eyes moved deliberately from child to child until they landed on Ava, sent an uneasy chill down her spine. Then, he started walking toward her daughter. His steps were slow, purposeful, cutting through the playground's carefree energy like a knife. Laura's smile faded. Her heart pounded as she rose to her feet, the book slipping to the ground, forgotten. Ava, still perched at the top of the slide, waved again. "Mama." But before Laura could take a step, the officer reached out and grabbed Ava's arm. "What are you doing here?" "You don't belong here," he barked, his voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. Ava's giggle turned into a startled whimper. She tried to pull away, confusion and fear flashing across her small face. Tears welled up in her eyes as she cried out, "Mama." Laura's pulse roared in her ears as she rushed forward. "Let her go," she shouted, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. The officer didn't budge. Instead, he turned to Laura, his expression cold and unmoved. "Ma'am, step back. This is official business." "Official business? A grown man manhandling a child?" Laura's hands clenched into fists. "She's my daughter. You have no right to touch her." Other parents had started to notice. Some reached for their phones, recording as the scene spiraled into something dark and wrong. The joyful hum of the playground was gone, replaced by whispers, uncertainty, and a thick, suffocating tension. Laura tried again, reaching for Ava's free arm, but the officer shoved her back, hard. She stumbled but caught herself, her eyes blazing with fury and fear. Ava sobbed louder, her little body trembling in his iron grip. And then, just as the weight of the moment threatened to crush her, something shifted. A presence. A force. A figure, tall and unmistakably powerful, moved with quiet determination toward them. His strides were steady, unhurried, yet filled with an energy that sent a ripple through the crowd. Dwayne Johnson. He had been enjoying a simple walk with his daughters when Ava's cries sliced through the air. One glance was all it took. The sight of a terrified little girl in the grasp of a uniformed officer made his blood run cold. He knew he couldn't just stand by. Parents and children who had been frozen in shock now turned their eyes to him, their whispers spreading like wildfire. The atmosphere crackled. Because the moment Dwayne Johnson stepped in, everything changed. A towering figure, calm yet commanding, exuded an undeniable aura of control as he strode forward. Dwayne's daughters, sensing the weight of the moment, stayed behind with a family friend while he walked straight toward the unfolding chaos. "Hey," his voice rang out, firm and steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. The officer didn't turn immediately, but Ava's cries faltered when she saw the man approaching. "Let her go." Dwayne's tone was deep, unwavering, and absolute. The officer finally turned, his face tightening with irritation and disbelief. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you." Dwayne kept walking, closing the distance with unshaken resolve. You've got a terrified little girl in your grip. It concerns all of us. Ava, still trembling, reached toward her mother, who stood frozen, caught between fear and relief. Laura's voice wavered as she tried to speak, but Dwayne held up a hand, silently telling her to stay calm. The officer squared his shoulders, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so openly. "This is a law enforcement matter," he said, his voice rising as if sheer volume could reinforce his authority. "Step back." Dwayne didn't flinch. "A law enforcement matter," he repeated, his voice edged with controlled fury. "She's a child. And you're terrifying her." His words were deliberate, his tone unwavering. "You're the one who needs to step back." The officer's jaw clenched. He glanced at the growing crowd, their phones raised, recording every second. The weight of dozens of eyes bearing down on him only seemed to agitate him further. With a sharp exhale, he abruptly released Ava's arm, but his fists remained clenched, his posture rigid. Ava stumbled into her mother's arms, Laura pulling her close, shielding her with every ounce of strength she had. "That's enough," Dwayne said, stepping forward again, his massive frame now a wall between the officer and the child. His voice was low but carried the kind of weight that silenced the room. "You don't put your hands on kids. Ever." The officer's lip curled in frustration as he jabbed a finger at Dwayne. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Dwayne leaned in slightly, his voice dropping but losing none of its force. "What I'm getting into is making sure that little girl feels safe again." The officer's face reddened, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He took a step back, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "You think you can just walk up here and play hero? This is my job." Dwayne's gaze didn't waver. "Your job is to protect, not intimidate." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Dwayne's presence. A few people clapped, others called out in support. Right now, the whole world was watching. The officer glanced around, feeling the pressure of the cameras, the eyes, the judgment. His bravado faltered, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat completely. "You don't tell me how to do my job," he muttered, though the words felt more like a weak defense than a statement of authority. Dwayne didn't even blink. Instead, he looked down at Ava, who clung to her mother, her sobs subsiding but her small body still trembling. His expression softened as he crouched slightly to meet her tear-streaked face. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Ava nodded hesitantly, her tiny fingers gripping her mother's sleeve like a lifeline. Laura, her voice still shaking, managed to whisper, "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Dwayne gave a small nod, but his eyes never left the officer. The man was still there, still bristling, his hand hovering near his radio. Dwayne straightened, his gaze locking onto the officer's, silently daring him to escalate this further. The officer muttered something into his radio before turning sharply and retreating toward the park's edge. Dwayne watched him go, his body still tense, ready for anything. Only when the officer disappeared from sight did he finally exhale, his shoulders relaxing, just slightly. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some stopping to offer their gratitude. "Thank you, man," one father murmured, clapping Dwayne on the shoulder. Dwayne nodded but kept his focus on Laura and Ava. "You two okay to get home?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Laura nodded, her voice stronger. "We'll be fine. Thanks to you." Dwayne glanced around at the lingering onlookers, his jaw tightening. "I don't think this is over yet," he muttered. He pulled out his phone, quickly exchanging numbers with Laura. "If anything else happens, call me." Laura hesitated for only a second before nodding. "We will." Dwayne gave Ava one last reassuring smile before stepping back. The tension in the air was fading, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed it. As he walked back toward his own family, his daughters rushing up to meet him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Then, just as he turned to leave, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the air. "You think you can just walk away?" Dwayne stopped in his tracks. Slowly, he turned. and what he saw made his blood run cold. The officer had returned. His face was flushed with anger and frustration, his movements erratic, his hand hovering dangerously close to the holster at his side. Dwayne turned slowly, his expression unreadable, his stance firm but calm. He locked eyes with the officer, his presence alone enough to shift the energy in the air. "I thought you had enough," Dwayne said, his voice steady. "You really want to do this here? With all these people watching?" The officer took a step closer, his pride pushing him forward despite the murmurs of the crowd that had begun gathering again. His gaze darted around briefly, but instead of backing down, he sneered. "You don't get to play the hero and walk away like nothing happened. You don't even know the full story." Dwayne tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I know enough. You grabbed a kid. Scared her. Hurt her. That's the only story that matters." The officer's lips curled into a snarl. "She was acting suspicious. I was doing my job." Dwayne let out a breath, his disbelief evident. "Suspicious?" His voice rose slightly. "She's 7 years old. She was playing on a slide. What exactly looked suspicious to you?" The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find a response. The silence was louder than any excuse he could have made. The crowd murmured louder now, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. Dwayne stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his presence as unyielding as a mountain. "You saw a little black girl having fun and decided she didn't belong," Dwayne said, his voice controlled but sharp. "That's not doing your job. That's abuse of power, and you know it." The officer's face darkened, his anger bubbling over. He lunged suddenly, shoving at Dwayne's shoulder in an attempt to push him back. Bad move. Dwayne was faster. His hand shot up, gripping the officer's wrist with unshakable strength, stopping him cold. "Don't," Dwayne said, his voice dropping to a low, rumbling warning. The officer yanked his arm, trying to break free, but Dwayne didn't let go, not immediately. He leaned in slightly, his eyes piercing, his voice a quiet storm. "You've already crossed too many lines. Don't make it worse." The officer finally stumbled back, his movements unsteady, his face burning with frustration. But doubt had crept into his expression now. He could feel the weight of the cameras, the dozens of eyes watching, recording, exposing him. His bravado was cracking. "You think you're untouchable because people know your name?" he spat, his voice laced with bitterness. "You're not above the law." Dwayne crossed his arms, his demeanor unshaken. "Neither are you. And right now, everyone here sees who's breaking it." The officer's fists clenched. His breathing was heavy, his pride fighting against the reality that was closing in on him. He looked around, realizing he had lost control of the situation. The confrontation had turned into a spectacle, one he couldn't win. And then, sirens. Faint at first, growing louder. The sound sliced through the air, each passing second bringing them closer. The officer's face twisted in frustration. He knew what was coming. His jaw clenched, his body stiff, but there was nothing left for him to do. With a sharp turn, he stormed off toward the park's edge, not saying another word. The crowd exhaled, the tension breaking at last. Murmurs rippled through the air, some in disbelief, others in relief. Some clapped, others shook their heads, but every single person knew they had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. Dwayne stayed rooted in place, his eyes locked on the officer until he was gone. Only then did he let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Nearby, Laura and Ava stood close, the little girl clutching her mother's hand like a lifeline. Laura approached cautiously, her eyes filled with both gratitude and lingering fear. "Thank you," she said softly, barely audible over the lingering chatter of the crowd. Dwayne turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad she's safe." Laura nodded, pulling Ava in tighter. The little girl buried her face in her mother's side, her small frame still trembling. "She's still scared," Laura admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know how to make her feel safe again. Dwayne crouched to Ava's level, his large hand resting gently on her small shoulder. His voice was warm, steady, the kind of tone that made even the scariest things seem a little smaller. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. "You're the bravest person here, you know that? What happened wasn't right, but you did nothing wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Ava peeked up at him, her eyes wide, still glistening with tears. "Promise?" she whispered. Dwayne smiled, the kind of smile that felt like an unshakable truth. "Promise." The sirens were close now. The moment wasn't over. Dwayne straightened, his face hardening once more as he turned toward the sound of approaching police cruisers. 2 vehicles pulled up, officers stepping out, their faces a mix of confusion and caution as they took in the scene. The crowd had thinned, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. Laura looked at Dwayne, uncertainty in her eyes. "This isn't over," Dwayne said quietly. "But you're not alone in this." Laura met his gaze, something stronger in her expression now. A nod. A silent understanding. And as the first officer approached, Dwayne squared his shoulders, standing tall, ready to face whatever came next. Because the fight wasn't over. And he wasn't walking away. The crowd had thinned slightly, but those who remained held their phones high, capturing every moment. Dwayne stood near the playground, his massive frame unmoving, while Laura clutched Ava protectively at her side. The officer who had instigated the conflict paced near the park's edge, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He stormed toward the newly arrived officers, gesturing wildly, his voice sharp as he tried to twist the story in his favor. Dwayne didn't take his eyes off him, his instincts sharp, ready for anything. A female officer with a calm demeanor and sharp, assessing eyes approached Dwayne. Her badge caught the last of the fading sunlight as she stopped a few feet away. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" she asked, her voice measured. Dwayne nodded, his tone steady. "That officer," he said, nodding toward the man now animatedly explaining himself to another officer, grabbed a child without cause. He scared her, hurt her, and wouldn't let her go. I stepped in to stop him." The female officer's expression remained unreadable, but she cast a quick glance toward Laura and Ava. She turned toward them, her tone softening. "Ma'am, is this true?" Laura stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Yes. My daughter was just playing on the slide. He came over, said she didn't belong here, and grabbed her. She was terrified. He wouldn't let her go, even when I tried to stop him." A shadow passed over the officer's face. She nodded. "Thank you," she said seriously. "Please stay here while we sort this out." She turned and motioned for the other officers to join her. Dwayne remained where he was, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he watched the discussion unfold. The group of officers spoke in low, tense voices, but Officer Price, the one who had started it all, was growing agitated. "I was doing my job," he snapped, his voice carrying across the park. "That man had no right to interfere." The female officer raised a hand, silencing him. "We'll handle this, Officer Price. Step aside." But Price wasn't done. His face twisted with anger as he pointed directly at Dwayne. "He assaulted me. He pushed me back and threatened me." Dwayne's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond immediately. He simply held the officer's gaze, his silence a statement in itself. The female officer turned back to him. "Is that true?" she asked, her tone even. Dwayne didn't hesitate. "I stopped him from hurting a child," he said simply. If he felt threatened by that, maybe he should think about why. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. A few voices rang out from different directions. "He's lying. We saw everything. That guy was way out of line. The kid was terrified." The female officer raised her hand again, calming the noise. She turned to Price, her expression firm. "We're going to take this one step at a time. You'll have your chance to explain." Price's mouth opened to argue, but another officer, one of his own, stepped in, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let it go," the officer muttered, his voice barely audible. Price stiffened but fell silent, his face dark with fury. The female officer turned to the crowd. "If you have videos or photos of what happened, we encourage you to share them with us. You can approach my colleagues here or send them directly to the department." People hesitated at first, but then one by one, they stepped forward, phones out, offering their evidence. Dwayne glanced toward Laura, who was now kneeling beside Ava, stroking her hair gently. His expression softened for a brief moment before he turned back to the female officer. "What happens now?" he asked. She exhaled, clearly weighing her words. "We'll review the footage and take statements. This incident will be investigated thoroughly. For now, we need everyone to remain calm." Price muttered something under his breath, but the female officer shot him a sharp look, shutting him down instantly. She turned back to Dwayne. "Thank you for stepping in," she said. "We'll make sure this is handled appropriately." Dwayne gave a small nod, but he didn't move. His stance remained firm. "I'll stay until I know they're safe," he said, motioning toward Laura and Ava. The officer acknowledged him with a slight nod. "Fair enough." As the situation slowly de-escalated, the crowd began to thin, though a few remained at a distance, still watching, still waiting to see how it would end. Laura approached Dwayne, exhaustion and gratitude written all over her face. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." Dwayne offered her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. This isn't over yet, but you're not alone in this." Laura nodded, her grip on Ava tightening protectively. The female officer stepped forward again, this time her tone softer. "We're going to escort you home," she told Laura. "Just to make sure you're safe." Laura hesitated, glancing at Dwayne. He gave her an encouraging nod. "Go with them. It's the right call." As Laura and Ava were led toward a waiting police car, Dwayne stayed behind, watching them go. The weight of the day settled heavily on his shoulders, but he stood tall, knowing he had done the right thing. Still, as he scanned the darkening horizon, a sense of unease lingered. Because something told him this wasn't over yet. This wasn't over, not yet. Within hours, the park confrontation spread like wildfire. Clips flooded social media, sparking outrage and admiration. Headlines screamed, "Dwayne Johnson confronts police over child's mistreatment." Others questioned, hero or troublemaker? By morning, Laura's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in, support from friends, encouragement from strangers, but also harsh criticism. Some accused her of escalating the situation, others of seeking attention. Overwhelmed, she turned off her phone. Ava, once full of life, withdrew. She clung to Laura, flinched at sudden noises, refused to play outside. The fear lingered. Dwayne, too, faced scrutiny. His agent warned of backlash, but he didn't care. This wasn't about his career, it was about doing what was right. Still, the media dissected his every move. Had he been a hero, or had he overstepped? Ignoring the noise, Dwayne reached out. "This will die down," he told Laura. "But until then, I want to make sure you're both okay." Laura hesitated but admitted Ava's not herself. "She's scared all the time." Dwayne's voice was firm. "Let me visit. Maybe I can help." That afternoon, Ava sat curled on the couch, gripping her stuffed animal. She eyed Dwayne cautiously. He crouched to her level, voice warm. "Hey, Ava. Remember me?" A small nod. "What happened that day wasn't right," he continued. "But you were so brave. Braver than most adults I know." A flicker of pride crossed her face. "I was," she asked softly. Dwayne smiled. "You were. And you're not alone. So many people think you're amazing." Ava's grip on her stuffed animal loosened. "Really?" "Really," he assured her. "And if you ever feel scared, remember, your mom and I, we've got your back." Ava's shoulders relaxed, a tiny smile forming. Laura, watching, wiped away tears. But outside their home, the fight wasn't over. Advocacy groups rallied, protests erupted, and Dwayne found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't planned to lead, but couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Ava slowly began to heal. With Dwayne's support, Laura helped her rebuild confidence. They attended community events, met other families with similar stories, and step by step, Ava's bright spirit returned. Yet, Officer Price remained defiant, insisting he had acted within his authority. His defense only fueled public outrage, calls for his dismissal growing louder. Dwayne met with Laura and Ava again. "This is bigger than what happened at the park," he told her. "We need to keep pushing." Laura hesitated. "I just want Ava to feel safe." "She will," Dwayne promised. "And so will a lot of other kids, because of what we're doing." The case went to court. The evidence was damning. Video footage and witness testimonies dismantled Price's defense. Dwayne testified with quiet conviction. "No child should ever feel unsafe in a place meant for joy," he said. "This wasn't about protection. It was about power. And it was wrong." Laura spoke next, voice shaking but determined. She recounted Ava's lingering fear, the sleepless nights, the stolen sense of safety. When the verdict was read, guilty of misconduct, dismissed from duty, relief rippled through the courtroom. It didn't erase the past, but it was a step toward justice. Outside, reporters swarmed. Dwayne faced them with the same resolve he'd shown from the start. "This isn't just about one officer," he told them. "It's about making sure every child feels safe. This is a victory, but the fight doesn't end here." His words spread, turning a moment into a movement. In the following months, the city implemented new training programs, advocacy groups gained momentum, and most importantly, Ava found her voice. She started sharing her story, inspiring other kids. One day, she brought home a flyer for a youth leadership program. "Can I do this, Mom?" she asked, eyes shining. Laura smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I think you'd be amazing." Dwayne stayed in touch, dropping by occasionally. On one visit, he handed Ava a notebook. "This is for your big ideas," he told her. "The world needs to hear them." Ava hugged it tightly. "I'm going to write everything." Seasons changed. Life moved forward. The park, once a place of fear, became home to laughter again. Then, one evening, an unexpected knock. Laura opened the door to find Officer Price. He looked different, less rigid, more uncertain. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly. I wanted to apologize." Laura's breath caught. "Why now?" she asked cautiously. Price sighed. "Because it's the right thing to do." He hesitated, then continued, "I've been working with a community outreach program. They've helped me see things differently. I know an apology won't undo what I did, but I needed to say it." Laura steadied him. The words seemed genuine, but trust wasn't rebuilt overnight. "Still," she nodded, "Ava's been through enough. If you're serious about change, prove it by making sure no one else goes through this." Price swallowed hard, nodding. "I will." As he walked away, Laura closed the door. "Who was that?" Ava asked, appearing beside her. Laura knelt, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "Just someone trying to make things right." Ava held up her notebook. "I wrote today," she said proudly. Laura smiled, pulling her into a hug. "You're going to change the world one day, Ava," she whispered. "I can already see it." And in that moment, she knew their story was no longer just about justice. It was about hope.